A single sentence whispered with the casual cruelty only the ultra-rich can afford was about to shatter the evening. In the most exclusive restaurant in New York City, a place where fortunes were won and lost over a single glass of wine, a young waitress was about to be humiliated. The man doing the humiliating was Gideon Wolfe, a billionaire whose name was a weapon on Wall Street. But what Gideon didn't know was that the woman he was about to mock held a key not just to the French menu he found so amusing, but to the one deal that could save his entire empire. The air inside L'Étoile Filante was different. It seemed to be filtered through money, smelling faintly of aged leather, expensive perfume, and the kind of ambition that could curdle milk. To Sophie Dubois it mostly smelled like pressure. At 26 she was a ghost in this world, gliding between tables laden with crystal and silver, her black uniform a stark contrast to the jewel-toned silks and bespoke suits of the clientele. Her feet ached. It was a deep, profound ache that started in her heels and shot up her spine, a constant reminder of the 12-hour shifts, the endless running, the precarious balance of her life. She was a doctoral candidate at Columbia University by day, a servant to the city's elite by night. The two worlds were separated by a chasm of wealth and status, and tonight that chasm felt wider than ever. Her assigned table was number 7, the most coveted booth in the house, nestled in a velvet-draped alcove with a private view of the glittering city skyline. And sitting in that booth was Gideon Wolfe. Sophie knew the name. Everyone did. Wolfe, the titan of private equity, the corporate raider, famous for his hostile takeovers and his even more hostile personality. His face, usually seen scowling from the cover of Forbes, was sharper in person. His eyes were the color of glacial ice, and they missed nothing. They scanned the room with a predator's lazy confidence, cataloguing, assessing, dismissing. Across from him sat Tiffany Davenport. She was exactly the kind of woman one expected to see with Gideon Wolfe, impossibly thin, draped in a dress that cost more than Sophie's annual tuition, with diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists. She held her phone just below the table, her thumb flicking across the screen with bored expertise. Sophie approached with practiced calm, her notepad held like a shield. "Good evening. Welcome to L'Étoile Filante. May I begin with some water for the table we have still, or sparkling?" Gideon didn't even look at her. He waved a dismissive hand. "Sparkling. And bring the wine list, the real one." The implication was clear. Don't bring the cheap stuff. Sophie nodded, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She returned with the water and a leather-bound tome that was the restaurant's wine Bible. Tiffany finally looked up from her phone, her lips curled into a perfect pout. "Giddy, this menu is entirely in French. How pretentious." Gideon smirked, a flash of white teeth in his tanned face. "It's not pretentious, my dear. It's authentic. It separates the wheat from the chaff." He looked directly at Sophie, a challenge in his eyes. "You agree, don't you?" Sophie felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. It was a test. It was always a test with men like him. "The chef believes it preserves the integrity of the classic dishes, sir." "The chef," Gideon repeated, savoring the word as if it were a joke. He leaned back, tapping a manicured finger on the menu. "All right then. Let's see. Tiffany, you want the scallops, don't you? Let's find them for you." He scanned the page, his brow furrowed in mock concentration. Then he looked at Sophie. "Help my girlfriend out. She's a little lost. Point her to the scallops." Sophie's training screamed at her to just point, to be subservient, to be invisible. But something in his condescending tone pricked at a part of her she usually kept locked away. "Of course," Sophie said, her voice even. She didn't point. Are you referring to the coquille Saint-Jacques poêlée, purée de panais, et sauce vierge, or perhaps the carpaccio? Gideon's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected a full sentence. Tiffany, however, was less impressed. "What did she just say?" Tiffany asked, wrinkling her nose. "It's just scallops. Why do they have to make it so complicated?" She looked at Sophie as if she were a piece of furniture that had suddenly spoken. Then she leaned in towards Gideon, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that was perfectly audible in the quiet alcove. "Honestly, Gideon, I doubt she can even read this herself. They probably just make them memorize a few of the popular items." The words hung in the air heavy and sharp. Humiliation, hot and swift, washed over Sophie. It was the casual dismissal, the assumption of her ignorance that cut the deepest. It wasn't just about her. It was a judgment on her uniform, her station, her very existence in their gilded world. Gideon Wolfe let the silence stretch, enjoying it. He watched Sophie's face, waiting for her to crumble. He saw a flicker of hurt in her eyes, and it fueled his sense of power. He chuckled a low, cruel sound. "Well, she's right, isn't she?" he said, finally turning his icy gaze back to Sophie. "It's a lot of fancy words for a simple dish. Must be tough." Sophie's hands, hidden behind her back, clenched into fists. Her knuckles were white. The noise of the restaurant faded away. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, the soft music, it all disappeared. All she could hear was Tiffany's whisper echoing in her head. She can't even read the menu. Every late night in the library, every sacrificed weekend, every ounce of passion she had poured into her studies, it all rose up in her chest like a tidal wave. The ache in her feet was gone, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. She had two choices: absorb the humiliation retreat and let them win, or she could unleash the part of herself she kept hidden beneath the apron and the polite smiles. She could show them who Sophie Dubois really was. She took a slow, deliberate breath. She looked not at Tiffany, but directly into the cold, arrogant eyes of Gideon Wolfe, and she made her choice. Sophie's posture changed. It was a subtle shift, but in the hyper-aware world of power dynamics that Gideon Wolfe inhabited, it was as loud as a gunshot. Her spine straightened. Her chin lifted a fraction of a degree. The weary subservience in her eyes was replaced by a clear, focused light. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The quality of it was enough. It was lower now, richer, and the faint, all-purpose American accent she used for service had vanished, replaced by the crisp, perfectly modulated tones of an educated Parisian. "Monsieur," she began, her gaze unwavering from Gideon's. "To suggest I cannot read this menu is an understandable, if regrettable, assumption based on my current attire. However, since you've expressed an interest in its authenticity, allow me to clarify a few points." Gideon's smirk froze on his face. Tiffany blinked her perfectly mascaraed eyelashes, fluttering in confusion. "The menu is not merely in French," Sophie continued, her voice weaving a spell in the quiet alcove. "It is written in a very specific, slightly antiquated culinary French that pays homage to Auguste Escoffier, the chef who codified the 5 mother sauces and modernized the French kitchen in the early 20th century. For example, your girlfriend's scallops." She gestured gracefully towards the menu, her fingers not quite touching the expensive cardstock. "The coquille Saint-Jacques, poêlée purée de panais, et sauce vierge. It's not just scallops. It describes a very precise preparation. The poêlées tells us they are pon serred, not grilled or baked. The purée of panais or parsnip is a classic winter pairing, chosen for its earthy sweetness to counterbalance the brininess of the scallop. And the sauce vierge, literally virgin sauce, is not a cream-based sauce as many assume. It's an uncooked vinaigrette of olive oil, lemon juice, chopped tomatoes, and basil. It's a post-Nouvelle Cuisine invention from the 1980s, a light, fresh, acidic counterpoint to the richness of the seared shellfish and the sweet puree. So you see, it's not just a description. It's a story of culinary evolution on a single line. Silence. Thick, profound silence. Gideon Wolfe, a man who silenced boardrooms with a single word, was utterly speechless. His mouth was slightly agape. Tiffany looked from Gideon to Sophie, and back again, her expression a comical blend of bewilderment and alarm. But Sophie wasn't finished. She had endured the humiliation, and now the dam had broken. "You also mentioned the wine list, monsieur. The real one." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, but it wasn't friendly. It was academic. "Are you perhaps in the mood for a Burgundy? If so, I would caution against pairing a powerful red like a Gevrey Chambertin with the delicate scallops. However, a white, perhaps a Meursault, from the Côte de Beaune, would be an exceptional choice. Its buttery notes derived from malolactic fermentation, and its hint of toasted hazelnut from the oak aging would complement the parsnip puree beautifully. We have a 2014 Domaine Rouleau that is drinking exceptionally well right now. The vintage had a cool summer leading to a higher acidity that would cut through the richness of the dish perfectly. She took a small breath. Or if you prefer to be more adventurous, you might consider a wine from the Loire Valley. A Sancerre would be the obvious choice, but I would direct your attention to a Savennière from just outside Angers. It's made from Chenin Blanc, a far more complex grape. It has the acidity of a Sauvignon Blanc, but with added notes of quince chamomile and a distinct minerality, what the French call goût de pierre à fusil, the taste of flint. It would elevate the dish from merely excellent to something truly memorable. She paused, letting her words settle in the stunned air. The manager, Mr. Peterson, had been alerted by the hostess that something was amiss at table 7. He was now standing a few feet away, his face pale, having heard the last 30 seconds of Sophie's dissertation. He looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Sophie finally turned her gaze to Tiffany, who was staring at her as if she'd just sprouted a second head. "And for you, madame?" Sophie said, her voice softening just a touch. "If you find the French intimidating, I would be more than happy to walk you through my personal recommendations or simply take your order in English. Our goal, after all, is to ensure you have a pleasant evening." The final sentence was delivered with such flawless, disarming professionalism that it was more devastating than any insult could have been. She had not only demonstrated her own towering intellect, she had circled back and performed her job as a waitress, perfectly highlighting their appalling lack of grace in the process. Gideon Wolfe slowly closed his mouth. The cogs were turning behind his icy eyes. He wasn't just processing the information about wine and scallops. He was reassessing everything. The world for him was a hierarchy. He was at the top. Waitresses were at the bottom. This woman, this waitress, had just taken his entire worldview, shattered it on the floor, and then offered to sweep up the pieces for him. He looked at Tiffany, who was fumbling for words. I think I'll just have a salad." Gideon ignored her. He looked at Sophie, and for the first time that evening he saw her. He saw the intelligence, the fire, the exhaustion she held at bay. He saw a puzzle he couldn't comprehend. He cleared his throat. "The Savennières," he managed to say, his voice raspy. "Bring the Savennières, and we'll need a few more minutes with the menu." Sophie simply nodded. "Excellent choice, sir." She turned and walked away, her back ramrod straight, leaving a battlefield of silence in her wake. She didn't see the look on Gideon Wolfe's face, a look of pure, unadulterated shock mixed with something else he hadn't felt in a very long time: intrigue. The rest of the meal was a strange, silent affair. Sophie delegated the subsequent service of table 7 to another waiter, pleading a sudden migraine. Mr. Peterson, his face still a pasty white, readily agreed, ushering her towards the staff room with a bewildered, almost fearful respect. He didn't understand what had just happened, but he knew it was far above his pay grade. Sophie sat on a lopsided stool in the cramped break room, the adrenaline slowly draining out of her, leaving a hollow, trembling exhaustion in its place. She buried her face in her hands. What had she done? She'd just talked back to Gideon Wolfe. She had, in no uncertain terms, intellectually annihilated one of the most powerful men in the city. Her job, the job she desperately needed to pay for her mother's escalating medical bills, was almost certainly gone. She could picture the scene now, Mr. Peterson wringing his hands, apologizing profusely to Mr. Wolfe. Mr. Wolfe, with a flick of his wrist, would have her fired, probably blacklisted from every high-end restaurant in Manhattan. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. And yet, beneath the fear, a small, stubborn ember of satisfaction glowed. She hadn't crumbled. She had stood her ground. For one brief, terrifying moment, she had refused to be invisible. She had used her knowledge, the one thing that was truly hers, earned through thousands of hours of relentless study, as a weapon and a shield. She had spoken her truth in the language she loved. The memory of the shock on Gideon Wolfe's face was a small, bitter victory, but a victory nonetheless. Meanwhile, back in the velvet alcove, Gideon barely touched his food. The riz de veau he had ordered, a dish he normally adored, tasted like ash. Tiffany chattered on about some socialite's ghastly fashion choice, but her words were just meaningless noise. His mind was replaying the scene over and over. It wasn't just that the waitress spoke French. It was how she spoke it. It wasn't the functional French of a hotel concierge. It was the French of an academic, of a connoisseur. The precision of her vocabulary, the historical context, the casual deployment of terms like malolactic fermentation and goutte de pierre à fusil. It was staggering. Gideon Wolfe hadn't become a billionaire by being unobservant. His entire career was built on seeing value where others saw nothing, on understanding the hidden mechanics of a system. And he knew with absolute certainty that a woman with that level of erudition and poise was not a waitress by choice. There was a story there, a massive, glaring inconsistency. And inconsistencies were Gideon's specialty. He was a man who dealt in facts, in assets, in predictable human behaviors like greed and fear. This woman operated on a different plane entirely. She had responded to his crude display of power, not with fear or anger, but with a confident, overwhelming display of intellect. She hadn't just won the battle, she had revealed that he was fighting in the wrong war. Tiffany's voice finally pierced his reverie. "Giddy, are you even listening to me? My God, you've been quiet ever since that rude waitress went on her little rant." She wasn't rude, Gideon said, his voice flat. She was precise. She was a show-off, Tiffany sniffed. Probably learned it all from a YouTube video to get bigger tips. Gideon looked at Tiffany, and for the first time, he saw her with a blinding, painful clarity. He saw the profound, cavernous emptiness behind her perfectly made-up eyes. Her insult wasn't just wrong, it was pathetic. It was the desperate jab of someone who knew on some level that they had just been in the presence of something far superior and had no tools to comprehend it. The meal ended. Gideon paid the exorbitant bill in cash, his mind working furiously. When the new waiter brought the receipt for him to sign, Gideon waved him away. He pulled a thick, heavy business card from a silver case in his jacket. On it was just his name, Gideon Wolfe, and a private cell number. No company logo, no title. It was a card that screamed power precisely because of its simplicity. With a gold pen, he wrote a short message on the back. He paused, then placed the card and 5 crisp $100 bills on the small black tray. "See that this gets to the waitress who took our initial order," he instructed the waiter. "The woman who knew about the wines, and only her." The waiter nodded, eyes wide at the size of the tip. A few minutes later, as Sophie was changing out of her uniform, her hands still shaking slightly, Mr. Peterson knocked on the door. He didn't look angry. He looked perplexed. "Sophie," he said, holding out the small black tray. "This is for you, from table 7. Sophie stared at the $500. It was more than she made in 2 grueling shifts. It was enough to cover her mother's new prescription. But it was the card that drew her eye. She picked it up. Gideon Wolfe. She flipped it over. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and decisive. "I was wrong. I would like to apologize properly. Please call me." Sophie sank back onto the stool, the card feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. This wasn't what she had expected. It wasn't a pink slip. It was an invitation. An apology from a man like Gideon Wolfe was rarer than a flawless diamond, and far more dangerous. She knew she should throw the card away. She should take the money, be grateful she still had a job, and never ever think about Gideon Wolfe again. Contacting him would be stepping into his world, a world of power and manipulation she couldn't possibly navigate. But as she stared at his name, the ember of satisfaction within her flickered brighter. He had acknowledged his mistake. He had, in his own way, admitted defeat. And the academic in her, the part that was driven by an insatiable curiosity, was intrigued. What did a man like that want from a woman like her? The card was a puzzle. And Sophie Dubois had never been able to resist a puzzle. The next morning, the glamour of L'Étoile Filante felt like a fever dream. Sophie's reality was the stale, scholarly scent of the Butler Library at Columbia University. Here she wasn't a waitress. She was a doctoral candidate in historical linguistics, a world away from pan-seared scallops and vintage wines. Her dissertation wasn't just about French. It was about the very specific evolution of the langue d'oil in the 12th century, and how the introduction of new trade goods documented in early merchant ledgers created new linguistic forms. It was esoteric, deeply academic, and the only thing she was more passionate about than her mother. Her office was a small, windowless carrel filled with towering stacks of books. Titles like The Phonological History of Old French and Sociolinguistics of Medieval European Markets were piled high. This was her sanctuary. Here her knowledge wasn't a party trick or a weapon. It was a craft. She sat staring at a facsimile of a 13th century manuscript, but the intricate Latin script blurred before her eyes. Gideon Wolfe's business card was lying next to her keyboard, a stark white rectangle in her world of aging parchment and academic dust. I was wrong. The words were a balm on the wound of yesterday's humiliation, but they were also a hook. Men like Wolfe didn't apologize out of altruism. An apology from him was an investment, a strategic move. He wanted something. The question was what her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. The caller ID read, Green Pastures Nursing Home. Her heart seized the familiar dread washing over her. Hi, this is Sophie. Sophie, darling, it's Anya Petrova. Relief washed over her. Professor Petrova wasn't just her doctoral advisor. She was her mentor, her academic mother, and one of the few people who knew the full truth of her situation. Anya was a force of nature, a Russian émigré who had become one of the world's leading philologists with a mind as sharp as a shard of glass and a heart as big as the Siberian plains she'd left behind. Anya, hello. Is everything all right? Everything is fine with me, my dear girl. The question is everything all right with you? I just stopped by to see your mother. She's in good spirits, but the facility administrator pulled me aside. They said the payment for this month is late. Sophie closed her eyes, the shame a physical weight. I know, I'm sorry. I thought I'd have it by the 1st. The last paycheck was smaller than I expected. She didn't mention that it was because she'd taken 2 unpaid days off to help her mother move into the facility. Her mother Eleanor had been a vibrant history teacher before the aggressive onset of early-onset Alzheimer's. In 6 short months, she had gone from grading papers to not recognizing her own daughter. The cost of her care at a reputable facility was astronomical, a ravenous beast that devoured every penny Sophie earned. Her father had passed away years ago, leaving them with little more than a mortgaged house and a mountain of books. The grant that had supported Sophie's PhD had run out. The waitressing job, once a way to earn extra money, had become her lifeline. Sophie, you cannot carry this alone. Anya said, her voice firm but kind. You are one of the most brilliant students I have ever had. Your dissertation is groundbreaking. You cannot let this financial pressure derail you. Have you looked into any emergency university funds? Or perhaps a loan? The funds are exhausted, and I can't take on a loan. It's too much of a risk, Sophie said, her voice cracking slightly. I'll figure it out, Anya. I always do. Stubborn girl. Anya sighed, but there was affection in the words. Like your mother. Just be careful. This city can eat people like you alive. They ended the call and Sophie stared at the business card again. $500. That was the tip. A casual, thoughtless gesture for him. For her, it was a week of her mother's care. It was medicine. It was time. And then there was the apology. The offer to talk. What if this wasn't about a date or some kind of bizarre romantic pursuit? Men like Wolf dealt in assets. He had seen something in her, an asset, her knowledge. What if he wanted to hire her for what she couldn't imagine? Translating consulting. It was a wild, desperate thought, but her situation was wild and desperate. The humiliation from the night before still stung, but the fear of losing her mother to a disease she couldn't afford to fight was sharper. The need to finish her life's work, her dissertation, was a constant driving ache. She thought of her mother, sitting in a sun-filled room, her memories slipping away like sand through her fingers. She thought of the stacks of bills on her small apartment desk. She thought of Professor Petrova's worried voice. With a trembling finger, she picked up her phone. She looked at the stark white card at the private number that probably connected to the highest corridors of power in the city. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She was not a waitress. She was not a victim. She was Sophie Dubois, a scholar, a daughter, and she was going to fight for her future with the only tools she had. She dialed the number. It rang only once. Wolf, a familiar, crisp voice, answered. No hello. Just his name stated as a fact. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Hello, he said, a hint of impatience in his tone. She found her voice. Mr. Wolf, she said, her tone, as level and professional as she could manage. This is Sophie Dubois. You left a card for me last night. You said you wanted to apologize. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, the arrogance was gone, replaced by something else. Respect, Ms. Dubois, Gideon Wolf said. Thank you for calling me back. I'm glad you did. Gideon suggested they meet, not at a restaurant, not at his office, but at a neutral location of her choosing. It was a subtle but significant concession, a ceding of home field advantage. Sophie, thinking strategically, chose a small, unassuming coffee shop near the Columbia campus, her territory. It was noisy, crowded with students, and utterly devoid of the oppressive luxury of his world. She saw him before he saw her. He looked entirely out of place, his impeccably tailored charcoal suit a stark contrast to the sea of hoodies and jeans. He wasn't checking his phone or looking impatient. He was simply watching the controlled chaos of the cafe, his gaze sharp and analytical. When he spotted her, he stood up. He was taller than she remembered. Ms. Dubois. Sophie. Thank you for coming. Mr. Wolfe, she replied, not offering a smile. She sat down, placing her worn leather satchel on the chair beside her. Please call me Gideon. He sat his movements, economical and precise. A cup of black coffee was already waiting for him. I'll get straight to the point. My behavior at the restaurant was inexcusable. It was arrogant boorish, and I am genuinely sorry. There's no excuse for it, but I want to offer an explanation, if you'll hear it. Sophie nodded, her expression unreadable. I live in a world of assumptions, he began, his voice low and serious. I assume people want something from me. I assume their motives are transparent. I categorize people instantly. It's a survival mechanism in my line of work. I categorized you. I was profoundly, demonstrably wrong. What you did, it wasn't just about speaking French. You held up a mirror, and I didn't like the reflection. It was a more introspective and honest apology than she had ever expected. He wasn't just apologizing for being rude. He was admitting a fundamental character flaw. It was disarming. Apology accepted, Mr. Wolfe, she said coolly. Is that all? A flicker of a smile touched his lips. No, that is not all. He leaned forward slightly. I spent half the night trying to figure you out. The linguistics, the encyclopedic knowledge of viticulture, the poise under pressure. It didn't add up. So I made a few calls. Sophie's blood ran cold. You investigated me. I have a research department, he corrected, though they both knew it was the same thing. Wolfe Global has the best. They found a Sophie Dubois, a doctoral candidate in historical linguistics at Columbia, specialization in Old French, author of a paper, Mercantile Influences on 12th Century Norman Dialects, that was published in the Journal of Philological Studies. Recipient of the Dean's Fellowship for 3 consecutive years. That fellowship I found was recently terminated. I also found that your mother, Eleanor Dubois, was recently admitted to green pastures for long-term care. Sophie felt exposed, violated. A cold anger rose in her. You had no right to look into my personal life. I agree, he said, without a trace of defensiveness. It was an invasion of your privacy, but it was a necessary one for what I'm about to propose. I wasn't digging for dirt, Sophie. I was trying to understand the context. I was confirming that what I saw at the restaurant wasn't a fluke. It wasn't. You're brilliant, and you're in a difficult position. He paused, letting his words sink in. I have a problem, Sophie. A very big, very expensive problem, and I believe you are uniquely qualified to help me solve it. Sophie's anger warred with her curiosity. What kind of problem? A French one, he said. Wolfe Global is in the final stages of a hostile takeover of Beaumont Holdings. Sophie knew the name. Beaumont was one of the oldest and most prestigious luxury goods conglomerates in France. They owned heritage perfume houses, ancient vineyards, and artisan leather workshops. It's the biggest deal of my career, Gideon continued, his voice tight with intensity. But it's stalling. We've hit a wall, and it's not financial. It's cultural. The CEO, Conrad Beaumont, is old guard French. He's running circles around my legal team. He communicates in subtleties, in historical allusions, in cultural references that they completely miss. Our translators give us the literal meaning of his words, but they don't give us the intent. He's using his culture, his language as a weapon, and he's winning. Suddenly it all clicked into place. The apology, the research, this meeting. You want to hire me? Sophie stated it wasn't a question. I don't want to hire you as a translator, Gideon said, shaking his head. I have dozens of those. I want to hire you as a strategist, a cultural interpreter. I need someone who doesn't just understand the language, but understands the soul behind it. Someone who knows the history, the pride, the intricate dance of French business etiquette. I need you to be in the room to listen to what's not being said. I need you to read the menu, so to speak. The irony was not lost on her. He was offering her a job based on the very skill set he had mocked just 2 nights ago. The final round of negotiations is in 10 days. In Paris, he said, I will pay you a consulting fee of $200,000 for 1 week of your time. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. $200,000. It was a fantasy number. It would pay for her mother's care for years. It would allow her to quit her job at the restaurant, finish her dissertation without the crushing weight of debt, and secure her future. It was a life-altering amount of money. But it came at a price. Working for him. Stepping into his ruthless world, a world of hostile takeovers and corporate raiders. She looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't the same man from the restaurant. The arrogance was still there, but it was tempered by a new respect. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was making a business proposition. He needed her expertise. He was acknowledging her value. I have terms, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Gideon leaned back, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. I would expect nothing less. First, Sophie began counting on her fingers. I am a consultant, not an employee. I will have a formal contract reviewed by my own legal counsel. She'd ask Professor Petrova for a recommendation. Second, my analysis and opinions are to be delivered directly to you. I will not report to a committee of your lawyers who will then filter my findings. Third, beyond the scope of this project, you will make no further attempts to look into my personal life. My privacy is not for sale. She took a breath, locking his gaze. And fourth, you will fund the Eleanor Dubois Grant for Philological Studies at Columbia University, a $50,000 endowment. In her name. It was an audacious demand, a gamble. But she wasn't just negotiating for money anymore. She was negotiating for respect for her mother's legacy. Gideon stared at her for a long moment. The analytical look was back in his eyes. He was calculating, weighing the costs and benefits. Finally, he nodded slowly. Done, he said. On all counts. My legal team will have a contract drawn up by the end of the day. He extended his hand across the table. Do we have a deal, Ms. Dubois? Sophie looked at his outstretched hand. It was a hand that dismantled companies and built empires. Taking it meant stepping across a threshold into a world she didn't understand, a world that could easily chew her up and spit her out. But it was also a hand that offered a solution to all her problems, a chance to use her knowledge in a way she never dreamed possible. She took his hand. His grip was firm, confident. We have a deal, Mr. Wolfe. The Paris that greeted Sophie was not the one from postcards. There were no accordion players on street corners, no lovers strolling hand in hand along the Seine. Her Paris was a city viewed through the tinted window of a black sedan, a blur of grey mansard roofs, and fleeting glimpses of history culminating in the jarring hypermodern geometry of La Défense. The business district rose from the ground like a collection of glass and steel shards, a sterile fortress designed for global commerce, deliberately separate from the soul of the city that shimmered in the hazy distance. The boardroom on the top floor of the Tour Éclat was an exercise in minimalist intimidation. A single colossal mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, stretched across the room. On one side, Gideon's team, a phalanx of American lawyers and bankers, including the bulldog-like Peters, their movements sharp, their faces set with predatory focus. They were sharks in bespoke suits, smelling blood in the water. On the other side sat Conrad Beaumont and his entourage. Beaumont himself, in his late 60s, was a masterpiece of patrician elegance. With a lion's mane of silver hair and a deceptively gentle smile, he looked more like a tenured humanities professor than a corporate titan. His eyes, however, held the shrewd, weary cunning of a man guarding a centuries-old dynasty. His team was smaller, older, and exuded a quiet, unshakable confidence that Gideon's team mistook for weakness. For 2 full days, Sophie was a ghost. She sat in a chair set slightly behind Gideon, her official title of linguistic consultant, earning her little more than a flicker of amused curiosity from Conrad Beaumont, and complete indifference from her own side. She filled her notepad with observations, saying nothing, simply watching the 2 corporate cultures collide like tectonic plates. The clash was excruciating. Gideon's team, led by Peters, would launch a salvo of data-driven arguments, citing market valuations, shareholder obligations, and projected growth models. They spoke in the language of numbers, a universal tongue they believed was irrefutable. In response, Conrad Beaumont would not offer a counter-argument. He would offer a story. When Peters aggressively detailed a plan to streamline production by closing a small historic silk-weaving atelier in Lyon, Beaumont tilted his head. It is remarkable he mused, staring out the window. The cicadas are singing earlier this year. My grandfather always said that an early song meant a long, hot summer. Peters's face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Mr. Beaumont, he gritted out, we are discussing a projected 7% increase in operational efficiency. We are not discussing insects. Beaumont's gaze drifted back to him, his expression one of mild bewilderment. Ah, but are they not connected? The health of the land, the rhythm of the seasons, the quality of the mulberry leaves the silkworms depend upon. One cannot simply separate the thread from the tapestry. It is all one thing, no. The Americans saw only senile ramblings, a deliberate and infuriating stonewalling tactic. They failed to see the intricate web of meaning Beaumont was weaving. They were playing checkers. He was painting a masterpiece. That night, the atmosphere in the hotel suite that served as Wolf Global's command center was thick with frustration. Empty coffee cups and remnants of a room service dinner littered every surface. Laptops glowed, casting a pale, anxious light on the faces of the team. Gideon stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, staring at the Eiffel Tower, which had just begun its hourly sparkling dance, a celebration of a city he was failing to conquer. He's toying with us. Peters paced, his fists clenched. The old fox is running out the clock, hoping we'll get frustrated and walk away. Gideon turned from the window, his face grim. The pressure was immense. His reputation and billions of dollars were on the line. He looked past Peters, past the other lawyers, his gaze landing on the one person who hadn't said a word. Sophie. The room quieted. All eyes turned to her. You've been in that room for 16 hours. You see things we don't. What is happening in there? Sophie took a deep breath, the weight of their collective expectations settling on her. She opened her notebook, the pages filled with her precise script. You're losing, she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension. You're losing badly, and you don't even know it. You think you're in a business negotiation? You're not. You're in a cultural trial, and you have been found wanting. Peters scoffed. "What is that supposed to mean? We've made a more than generous offer." "Your offer is an insult." Sophie countered her gaze, unwavering. "Not because of the number, but because of the philosophy behind it. You're not just trying to buy his company, you're trying to erase his culture. Every time you talk about efficiency and streamlining, he hears destruction and disrespect." She pointed to her notes. "Let's go back to the cicadas and the silk. He wasn't talking about insects, Mr. Peters. He was telling you that his business isn't a machine with replaceable parts. It's a living ecosystem. The weavers in Lyon aren't just employees. They are families who have passed down their craft for generations. Their skill is tied to the land, to the seasons, to the very cicadas he mentioned. By suggesting you could just close their workshop, you told him you have no concept of terroir, not just for wine, but for craftsmanship. You revealed that you don't understand the fundamental nature of the asset you're trying to acquire." She flipped a page. "And this afternoon, you proposed replacing his artisanal leather suppliers with a more cost-effective manufacturer in Asia." Beaumont's response was a single proverb: "Il ne faut pas vendre la peau de l'ours avant de l'avoir tué." "Don't sell the bear's skin before you've killed it," Gideon translated a frown, creasing his brow. "A warning not to get ahead of ourselves. It's so much more than that." Sophie insisted, her passion for the subject rising to the surface. "That proverb is from the Fables of La Fontaine. It's a story about a foolish hunter who presumes victory and is mauled by the bear. In that context, who is the bear he is? His company? His legacy? By using that specific phrase in response to a question about artisans, he was casting you as the brutish, arrogant hunter, and himself as the powerful force of nature you underestimate. He wasn't just rejecting your proposal, he was calling your entire approach clumsy and barbaric." A stunned silence filled the suite. The lawyers looked at each other, their bravado evaporating. Gideon sank into a chair, running a hand over his face. He finally understood. They had been speaking a different language all along, and it had nothing to do with French or English. "He thinks we're barbarians," Gideon said, his voice low. "Worse," Sophie replied softly. "He thinks you're soulless. Conrad Beaumont isn't afraid of losing money. He's a wealthy man. He's terrified of his family's legacy being hollowed out and sold for parts by men who see the price of everything and the value of nothing." Gideon looked up, his eyes locking with hers. The frustration was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "Tell me how to fix it." The coaching session lasted until 3 a.m. It was a remarkable role reversal. Sophie, the waitress, became the teacher. Gideon, the billionaire titan, became the student. She corrected his pronunciation, not for accent, but for emphasis. She explained the cultural weight of humility, the power of acknowledging history. She fed him stories, anecdotes, and phrases she had unearthed from Beaumont's company archives and old interviews. He absorbed it all with a desperate, uncharacteristic humility. The next morning, when they walked back into the boardroom, something had shifted. Gideon began not with a financial projection, but with a story. "Monsieur Beaumont," he started his French, measured and respectful. "I was unable to sleep last night. I found myself reading about your great-grandfather, Henri Beaumont, and his response to the phylloxera epidemic in the 1880s. Across the table, Conrad Beaumont's posture changed, his curiosity piqued. He didn't panic. Gideon continued the story, flowing naturally, just as Sophie had coached. He didn't abandon his land. He traveled to America, a place he considered quite wild, and brought back resistant rootstock to save his vines. He used a foreign innovation not to replace his tradition, but to ensure its survival for future generations. He paused, looking Beaumont directly in the eye. That is what I propose, a partnership. To use the strength of my global network to protect the priceless legacy you and your family have built. For the first time in a week, a genuine smile touched Conrad Beaumont's lips. You have been doing your homework, Monsieur Wolfe. Perhaps we have more to discuss than I thought. The final deadlock came over a single clause in the company's original 19th century charter. It was an arcane point about land rights for the families who worked the vineyards, and Gideon's lawyers saw it as a legal nightmare that would impede any future restructuring. Beaumont was adamant the clause was sacrosanct. The original document was brought into the room with the reverence afforded a holy relic. It was laid on the table, a sheet of heavy yellowed parchment, brittle with age, and covered in a spidery faded script. Sophie leaned forward, her heart thrumming. This was not a legal document to her. It was a time capsule. This was her world. Her eyes, trained by years of deciphering ancient texts, scanned the Old French. Then she saw it. A jolt, electric and pure, shot through her. It was a single word nestled in a long, looping sentence. Métayage. Gideon, she whispered, her voice urgent. The lawyers are wrong. They're mistranslating a key term. What do you mean? He hissed back, sensing the shift in her energy. They're reading métayage with its modern definition, which is a specific type of agricultural lease close to sharecropping. They see it as a legal liability, she explained, her mind racing, connecting a decade of study into a single point. But in the Aquitaine dialect of the 1850s, its meaning was broader, more philosophical. It comes from the old French moitié, meaning half. It didn't just mean sharing the crops. It implied a sacred familial partnership, a société between the landowner and the artisan. It meant sharing a destiny. The clause isn't about legal tenancy. It's a moral covenant. Taking a breath, Sophie stood up. The room fell silent. She was no longer a ghost. Monsieur Beaumont, she said, her voice clear and resonant, her French as pure as any in the room. Forgive my interruption, but I have a question regarding Article 12. Beaumont inclined his head, his eyes sharp with intrigue. The central principle of the article rests on the term métayage, she stated. Is it your unwavering position that this term represents a legally binding tenancy in perpetuity, or is it, as I suspect, intended to represent the sacred principle of partage de fruits, a moral partnership where both owner and artisan share in the risks and the rewards as a family, thus bound by honor rather than mere law? The effect was profound. Conrad Beaumont stared at Sophie, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at this young woman who had somehow reached back through time and grasped the very soul of his great-grandfather's intent. He slowly pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. "Young lady," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that silenced the room. "In 40 years of business, dealing with bankers and lawyers from all over the world, you are the first person sitting on that side of the table who has understood the heart of this document." He turned his astonished gaze to Gideon. "Monsieur Wolfe, your lawyers are American. But this woman," he gestured to Sophie, "this woman has a French soul. Perhaps there is hope for you yet." A slow smile spread across his face. "Let us put the lawyers aside for a moment. Let us speak of partnership." The dam did not crack. It vanished. The deal was signed that afternoon. As the lawyers shook hands and exchanged strained pleasantries, Gideon watched Sophie quietly gathering her notes. She had not only saved his deal, she had unraveled the very heart of his rival with nothing but her intellect and a profound respect for the past. He realized with a humbling certainty that he had not just acquired a company. He had stumbled upon something infinitely more rare, and infinitely more valuable. In the end, it wasn't about the money, though the money changed everything for Sophie. It paid for the best care, for her mother established a grant that would help students for generations and gave her the freedom to finish her life's work. It wasn't about the job, though. Gideon offered her a permanent high-level position as Wolf Global's chief cultural strategist, a role created just for her, which she accepted on the condition that she could still teach a seminar at Columbia each spring. No, in the end, this was a story about the profound, often invisible value of a person. It was about what happens when we dare to look past the uniform, the job title or the bank account, and see the lifetime of passion, knowledge, and resilience hidden within. Gideon Wolf. A man who thought he could buy the world learned a priceless lesson from a woman he tried to humiliate. The true power isn't about silencing others, but about having the wisdom to listen. And Sophie Dubois, a scholar who was struggling to stay afloat, discovered that her unique brilliance had a place not just in dusty libraries, but in the highest echelons of the modern world. Their story is a powerful reminder that the most extraordinary people can be found in the most ordinary of places, and sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the only one who can show you the way forward. If this story of unexpected